Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzaccelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy, in for Jason Gale. And I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy. And today we'll be talking about the political responsibility of Christians. Now, before we get started, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and select notifications. And of course, share this content with your friends. Now, Dr. Smith, why don't you get us started?
Okay.
The political responsibility of Christians. Is there one?
Yes, there is. Yes. Yeah. Podcast over. Right. Yes, there is a response. Christians do have a political responsibility. It's really interesting, that question would even sort of arise, right, in some ways. And I think it's really interesting that, this comes from all different angles. One, there are Christians who are very politically motivated, who are conservative, and those are the people who are usually sort of picked out as being involved in being Christian and involved in politics. But it's also true on the progressive side, right? Progressive Christians tend to be very politically active as well, which is in the other direction, right? So we have, both, I think, on the left and the right, politically active people who are or self-identify as Christian in some sense or the other. There's another interesting sort of tradition, right, which would be kind of the Anabaptist sort of tradition, right, that sort of wants to reject politics altogether as unworthy of Christians, right? So that's another sort of, and very few people are card-carrying Anabaptists today, but there is that strain, right, where you just sort of say, like, politics is kind of outside of or beneath Christian faith, or I don't want to have anything to do with it, right? There's something, I guess Stanley Hauerwas would probably be the strongest representative of that in the contemporary theological setting, right? Where you just sort of say, Christians should just step out of the political as much as possible, right?
Yeah. So in the weakest sort of manifestation of this attitude, right, I would say that you have the people who say, well, it's all corrupt, right? Everybody's in it for themselves, blah blah blah, and so I don't want to have anything to do with it. But that's the same excuse given by completely secular people who have no religious or moral commitments, really. They just see it as a. So what's a genuinely Christian response that could be given that might actually land in that place? Well,
the right place, yeah.
I think, well, let's say in that particular place, which I don't think is the right place.
Okay.
I think one might appeal to some of the fathers of the church for that, right? They might go back to the early fathers who basically told Christians to have nothing to do with anything going on in the Roman Empire. But I think the scenario is arguably very different, right? I mean, and maybe someday it wouldn't be different, right? There probably are countries, I think there are probably places in the world now that where this criticism would still be valid, right? But at the time, of course, Christianity wasn't a legal religion, right? And the Roman Empire was doing things actively that were pretty evil.
Sure.
And so Christians were seen as being implicated in those actions if they should get involved in politics. And certainly the situation was also different in that, we didn't go to the voting booth, right? Back in ancient Rome, it wasn't like people just went to the voting booth.
Sure. Right. Yeah. It's a significantly different situation.
So I think that kind of an appeal is going to be harder to defend today, right?
Sure. Yeah. And I think really the question then pushes towards, okay, well, it's, moving away from maybe the circumstantial, right, to the, sort of in itself, which is applicable, I still think today, which is that I think the position you want to end up in is neither rejecting politics altogether, nor conflating politics and religion.
Yeah. Right.
And so what I want to do is say that, put positively, that Christian faith and politics that these things are really distinct, but they're also really related, which is maybe sounds a little paradoxical first. Maybe there's some tension there, but I think both sides of that really have to be held in order to have kind of a authentic view of the responsibility of a Christian towards the political community.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. And I think, in the course of my career at various conferences and things, I've written on this kind of thing. I've presented on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say that it's not an easy question to answer, right?
Sure,
exactly
right.
where how that balance is struck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because on the one hand, right, Christianity has a clearly hierarchical view of reality,
mm-hmm.
in which the things of heaven are the most important, and in this world, the church speaks for that concern,
Mm-hmm.
right,
Mm-hmm.
and has a sort of juridical authority over the governance of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's superior to the secular sphere, right,
mm-hmm.
the implication would seem to be that the secular sphere should fall under the governance of the church, and that would lead you to a theocratic position.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been tried in the past, but it hasn't always worked out the way we'd wanted it to.
Right. And actually, I would even say that, strictly speaking, I might want to distinguish between a confessional state and a straight theocracy.
Yeah.
Because often, even in its strongest forms, whether in Eastern Orthodoxy or Western Christianity, there's usually in the East, they talk about sort of a symphony, right? Or a kind of a orchestra, right? Where there's a kind of orchestration between the Christian prince and the church. And in the West, usually, right, even the strongest forms of the relatively strongest forms of church involvement, right, in politics still leaves the temporal authority in place, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the temporal authority needs to obey, right, the ecclesial authority, right? So those would be sort of the stronger positions I think that have been held. I think there's reasons to maybe be skeptical of those stronger positions, although again, I think a lot of the application of the ideas is very circumstantial to history, so I think, when you're dealing with ancient regimes in the past, right, you have to be a little bit circumspect, I think, in your evaluation of them, because you have to think about the kinds of societies that they were operating in, the kind of threats that they faced, that sort of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, one of the problems we have is that, the contemporary secular representative democracy, right, this kind of republic that we have in the United States, is historically a relatively new thing.
Sure.
And when it came around, right, the church was actually, they didn't really know what to do about it. They didn't know what to make of it. Right. And they were pretty negative on it, right, for a while.
Sure.
Also, it rose up in relation to many other secular political regimes that ended in sort of different places than we did, right? For example, the French Revolution ended very, very badly.
Sure.
And it was extraordinarily hostile to ecclesial authority. Whereas in the United States, we had the First Amendment. There was room for the church to continue to operate in some way, right?
Sure.
So that, the kinds of statements you see, say, in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, about secular democracy, right? They have to be understood in terms of, the church in the uniqueness of that historical period, trying to wrestle with new forms of government that it hadn't seen before.
Sure.
And squaring it with what had always been understood about the relationship between politics and faith. So
that gets complicated. Sure.
It's very complicated. And so I guess I guess I want to say maybe like we can establish some principles, I think,
Right.
right, and
Yeah. I think a framework. Yeah.
try to apply them to whatever framework we're in. But I
Hmm.
think often Americans, when they're involved in this kind of discussion, they lose sight
Hmm.
of the fact that we need to actually talk about how to relate religion and politics, faith, our faith commitment, and our political obligations
Hmm.
um, to the political structure of the society we're actually in.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, that's, our actual, this is one thing that's always funny. C.S. Lewis is really good on this, right? Is that our actual duties are always concrete,
Yeah,
right?
right, right.
We tend to sort of fantasize about our moral commitments to things that actually have very little to do with us, and put a lot of stock in that. Whereas, our actual obligations, right? The things that make us good or evil in terms of our moral lives are almost always concrete. It's
Yeah,
what am I
right,
doing for my children in this time? What am I doing for my state in this time? That kind of thing. But I
right,
think,
right.
if you're wanting but still you do need sort of like a principled framework, as you were alluding to. And I think that's where you kind of, one way of hashing that out is to say that they're really distinct and really related. So in what ways are they really distinct? And I think this is important, right? Because
Huh.
we do need to recognize, I think, a real and deep distinction between the two. Um, there is I think, rather dangerous impetus, especially in modern man, to expect too much of politics, and to, what in the past, sometimes people talked about as imitizing the eschaton, right?
Yeah,
Which I think is a phrase that's still worthy here. So I think there's two ways in which we can clearly see a distinction. One is teleological and the other is foundational.
hmm.
So in terms of teleology, right? So teleology is just about the end, the purpose, right? Um, the purpose, right, of the church. I mean, you could put this in a variety of different ways, but the church, is oriented towards the ultimate end of the human person,
Hmm.
whereas the political community is just, it might be oriented indirectly or secondarily, right? But in truth, the political community is just not sufficient to the task, right? The political community is really ordered towards what I would call, man's imperfect end. Now, let me just put in a qualification real quick here before anybody gets confused. I'm not saying there are two ultimate ends. That's a controversy for another day. Okay. I think the ultimate end is eternal beatitude, the kingdom of God. But we can still talk about ends that are nestled underneath that end, right?
Hmm.
And that would be the kind of end that the political community pursues, which is primarily concerned with, I would call, acquired active happiness, right?
Hmm.
As distinct from the perfect beatitude of the kingdom of God. Those are
Yeah,
two different ends, right? Does that make
right.
sense, Rich?
Yeah, it does to me. It does
Mm-hmm.
to me. I think, and that sounds right to me, right? On
Mm-hmm.
sort of a traditional Catholic anthropology,
Okay.
I would say that sounds right. I know there is disagreement within the church about certain things here,
Mm-hmm.
but I think if you just look at it like if we sort of extrapolate from the things that we say dogmatically, right? What
Mm-hmm.
is man's ultimate end?
Right. Right.
Beatitude, right?
Right.
It's
Sure.
to be with God in heaven.
That's right.
Um, what is the end of politics? Well, I mean, at a practical level,
Right. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
concerned with the things of this world. It's
Absolutely.
not the
Yeah.
cause of your salvation,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It may be instrumental in
Yeah.
that it could sort of establish and protect an arena within which it's possible for you to work out your salvation.
Sure.
Um, it could make room for the gospel to flourish, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's good,
Right.
but it's purely instrumental. It's not
Right.
it's not causal.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, just think about it this way. Like, I mean, do you really think that the president and the Congress, right, are the people that are primarily responsible for your eternal beatitude?
I should hope that that is not
That's right. I should hope not. Right.
the case.
I mean, these are, and I think this is a really a per se distinction, right? Um, Political communities existed before Christianity, and They were still political communities. And that's because they could be ordered towards this kind of lower end, right? That is a real good. Acquired active happiness just means kind of a just development of temporal goods and just exchange of temporal goods. Thomas Aquinas is very clear on this. He says, bodily goods, temporal goods, right? He's wanting to make clear, right, that this is there are certain kinds of goods and they're real goods, right, that politics is concerned with, but they are lower level goods, distinguished from the ultimate and perfect good, right?
Yeah. So
that is eternal beatitude.
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? It's important to distinguish a hierarchy of goods.
Mm-hmm.
And I think until very recently, it was easy for people to do that. I mean, even some more secular people clearly recognized that certain goods were more important than other goods. Goods of the mind, right, were usually considered better than goods of the body, or more significant, right? It's better to flourish than just to survive.
Sure.
Of course, in Christianity, right, we ratchet that distinction up significantly because we're talking about eternal beatitude.
Yeah, right.
So it's important to distinguish, but it's very interesting to me, though, that where I observe many Christians going off the rails today is that they prioritize the secular temporal goods, right, the bodily goods, over the spiritual. And the argument for this is usually given like, well, you can't preach on an empty stomach or something. You can't preach to somebody on an empty stomach. I mean, maybe, but at a practical level, what this ultimately means for many, not all, is they pay very little concern, right? They pay very little attention to the real goods of the church, and in the name of their Christian vocation, simply become essentially social workers.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that's almost, that's a problem, not so much with political order, right, as catechesis and preaching and, the theology, the practice of theology within the church, right? I mean, that's, or even if you want to include, ecclesial communities outside of the Catholic Church, I mean, that's something where you say, well, wait a second, you kind of have messed up your order here, right? You've made a mistake in terms of prioritization. These things are not exclusive, of course, mutually exclusive. One can, of course, and should care for the poor, right? Feed the hungry, clothe the naked. That's not an antithesis to preaching the gospel and adoring God. But certainly, I think you would want to say there's a prioritization there, right? That is, we're going toward, I mean, the worship, right, in church is the source and summit of Christian life, right? But we're going towards that, right? Ultimately, right? I mean, in the kingdom of God, there will be no naked or poor, right? That's the essential, right? Hierarchical sort of good that Christianity is to be pursuing.
So this is part of the tension, right? Where, Christ says, the poor you will always have with you. And he says this in response, right, to this idea that we should, we should use this revenue here to take care of the poor, right? This possible revenue to take care of the poor. The poor you will always have with you.
Right.
And you might hear that as really sort of a dismissive thing, that you shouldn't care for the poor don't matter. But I think that's a misinterpretation. I think what it's saying is you can't expect that in this world, fallen as it is, right, until all things come to completion,
right,
that the problems that you face, the problems with which politics deals will never really go away.
Sure. Yeah.
We can kind of make them better. We can make them worse.
That's right. We can,
right. We can take the edges off of things. Sure. But they're always going to be there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the things there, whereas again, you see though very easily there's a category mistake. You're speaking, I think, from a kind of a realist, right, sort of perspective. one that's realist, both I think from perspective of political philosophy, but also theologically realist. I think that a lot of people find that very hard to accept, and instead feel the need to imitize the eschaton there, right? To think of this world as if it were limitless, right? To think of this world as if we have an infinite amount of goods, right? That sort of thing. We don't, right? Like, this world has its limitations, right? This world will always have its limitations and corruptions, and those things cannot be eliminated, right? Without eliminating humanity, as the way I put it, right? Without eliminating fallen humanity altogether, right? I mean, eventually we shall enter the eschaton, right? And the sheep and the goats will be separated in such a way that we can expect an experience without limitation or corruption, right? But that's not this life, right? That's not this fallen world in which politics operates. I'd even go a little bit further and say, in terms of our care for the poor, there's a real distinction between what's due to the poor with respect to justice and what is praiseworthy to give to the poor out of charity, right? And I think very often we kind of conflate those two, and really I should probably use the term charity, but I'll just leave it there. Christians should go above and beyond justice with respect to their care for the poor. But that's not politics, right? Yeah. Right. Politics isn't charity. And I know I'm kind of pushing here a little bit where some kind of recent Catholic theology has gone, but I think that it's a mistake to conflate justice and charity. I think they're distinct virtues, and when we conflate them, we only lead to problems.
So, okay, I agree with this. And here's the way I would sort of explain it.
Okay.
Do you have an obligation to charity? I would say the answer to that question is yes.
Okay.
But that obligation is not an obligation of the political order. It's an obligation of the moral order. And you're in that case, the person to whom you're doing justice in charity is God, not the poor. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Sure. Yeah.
You owe to God this response to him. I think it seems to me, right? You owe to God this response to him. But that's one of those things that really I think we can say is between you and God.
Yeah.
It's not between you and the state.
Sure. And it's and then your beneficence, right, to the poor is an overflow, right, of that love that you have for God, right?
Yeah. He's benefiting because I have this relationship with God.
That's right. Yeah. So that's different than a debitum, I would say, in the political order.
In the political order, yeah.
So
again, I'm saying you do have a debitum, but it's a debitum to God.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. It's out of love.
I think that's an important distinction to make, right?
Sure.
Who do I really owe in this case?
Yeah. Yeah. And on what basis, right? So I think the debitum in the political order, right, is based on nature and acquired rights. That are
enforcing
temporal.
Charity would be outside the sphere, right, of its proper authority.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Because of the supernatural character, right, of what you're talking about in terms of eternal beatitude. This, the political community is just not apt to that end, right? It's apt to really the temporal goods, right? Just as Thomas says, a just exchange, development, and distribution of temporal goods. Now that doesn't mean not moral. It's still moral, right? In the sense that justice is a moral virtue, right? So there is morality involved. It's just not the specific morality of, say, the theological virtues, right? It's the morality of the acquired virtues, which is an imperfect kind of morality, but still a real kind of morality, right? That's the kind of thing you have to do if you're going to be, I think, serious about these issues from a philosophical perspective, and I'm sure from theology too, is you have to keep making that distinction. Imperfect but real, right? That kind of thing. It's I'm not saying that the justice, obviously, I hope, obviously justice is very important, and it's not strictly speaking a theological virtue either, right? We can make those sorts of distinctions. So it is a kind of morality, right? In fact, it's very common that a lot of the theologians and doctors picked up on the language of the civic virtues, right? In classifying the moral virtues, the cardinal virtues, I should say, so that all of the cardinal virtues, they help us with temporal life, right? They help us to live in a way that's just and virtuous in our handling of temporal goods. You think about temperance, right? Temperance is primarily about pleasures of bodily goods, right? And kind of dealing with desires and all that sort of thing. I have the sense that temperance is not going to be terribly important in the kingdom of God, right? Like in the final eschaton. Does that make sense? Whereas charity will, right? I mean, even faith and hope pass away, Paul tells us, right? So these are different levels, right, of virtue that are being dealt with. I think the other really clear way of distinguishing between the political realm and the church is to distinguish in terms of the basis, right? So the foundation, right, of Christian faith is supernatural revelation, right? The supernatural revelation of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, also supernatural revelation that we get, sort of in sacred scripture, etc. Whereas that's not the basis of political community. Now, certainly political community can, I think, benefit from divine revelation, maybe indirectly, but the basis for political community is really natural law, which is at least something in principle that can be known more or less through the light of natural reason. So I think those are important differences, and I think well, anyways, does that distinction make sense?
It makes, yeah, I think it does make sense, and I think it makes sense. All right. And there's more to talk about there, but I think you just mentioned natural law. And I think, one of the problems with natural law, right, is that in the fallen world, so if we're making a theological response to this issue, right, fallenness is a real thing.
Sure.
In the fallen world, our intellects are darkened and our wills are disordered. Right. And that's true of, like, not the Virgin Mary, but you and me, right?
Sure.
And everybody else you and I know. That's true of us, okay? And that means that our ability to sort of discern what it is that the natural law demands concretely in particular situations is going to be more obscure to some people than it is to others.
Sure.
And it also means that without the clarifying benefit of divine revelation, many people will be sort of hopelessly unable to really see the demands of natural law clearly.
Sure.
At least in, around the edges, right? So everyone recognizes, for example, culturally speaking, that the arena of human sexuality and sort of the propagation of offspring is an arena in which there are moral boundaries, right? Sure. Everyone recognizes that. But what we don't share cross-culturally is the details, right? Okay. So how many spouses can you have? Right? Sure. That sort of thing. So how do we, my question is, how do we then adjudicate the relationship between religion and politics when it comes to the application of the natural law in legislation?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we're in an advantageous spot because we don't have to be in the spot of Rome and ancient Greece, right? I mean, we have had the light of the gospel showed, right, forth in the history of Western civilization. So I think that gives us an advantageous position to be in, actually, right, in terms of the natural law. I think that gives us space where we can still use natural law as a measure and an appeal right, to those who might not share divine law with us, right? The new, especially in terms of the New Testament. But that can still be something to hold them to account, right? That is something that their reason should allow them to see. And I think we can see that, the best of non-Christian culture and thinking usually converges there, right? When you look at, say, the Roman Stoics or people of that nature, right? You can find, almost the exact same sexual morality, right? Supported by the Roman Stoics as you would find by St. Paul, and not on the basis of the New Testament, right? So I think those would be ways in which we could still recognizing what you're talking about, right? Which is its limitations, the limitations in a fallen world of natural law, but nevertheless that it can still serve as some kind of common basis, imperfect as it is.
Yeah. So the reason I raise the question, obviously, right, is that, there's that objection people make when it comes to legislating on abortion or something, right?
Okay.
Which I find to be just really weak, where they say, I believe that abortion is wrong, but I would never impose my religious views on other people.
Sure.
And I would argue that it's not really what you have to do in order to legislate on abortion.
Sure.
I wouldn't want to say that abortion is not a religious issue.
Sure.
Right. Some people would say that it isn't. I would say that it is a religious issue, but it's not only a religious issue. Right. It's clear. It seems to me, obviously, abortion is a natural law issue. And sure. I don't have to be religious to perceive the natural law. I would say I have to be religious maybe to perceive the natural law in its fullness.
Sure.
But I don't have to be religious to perceive it at all. I mean, we know this because we have pagans in the ancient world, as you pointed out, who did perceive the natural law.
Right. Sure. And it is interesting on this point, it's really interesting in America, about this, that, Roe v. Wade happened a good long time ago. Right. And, advocates of abortion like to claim that it's a matter of settled law, but really it's not. It's been contended ever since it was.
Yeah, it was never.
I mean, it's not like other areas of law where there's a general consensus, right? There was a change in a general consensus, say on matters of race, for example, and Dred Scott case and all that sort of thing. This is an area where there has been endless contention, and I would even say mounting contention to this day.
Yeah.
So I think that, from a hopeful perspective, I think of that as a witness of the natural law, right? Convicting people, as well as, the divine law, even more strongly.
In fact, if you look at the surveys on the question of abortion, right, it's what's interesting is if you come away with any conclusion about a consensus, the consensus is that it ought to be restricted.
Yeah, that's right. That is the consensus position. Yeah.
How much is
up for debate?
Still a matter of debate.
Yeah.
But
almost, you can get large majorities for the last trimester, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the very least.
In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, right, the survey suggests a super majority starting at the second trimester.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah. So that's where, even in this, fallen world, right, the natural law can still be a prod, but I think it's important, right? In thinking about politics and religion, right, within the church, we have an advantage, right, in terms of governing our own lives, right, that we have not just the natural law, but we also have divine law, right? We have the witness of revelation and the example of Jesus Christ. That elevates, right, our opportunities to live in a morally upright way, and distinguishes from the natural law. So the natural law is a real basis of morality, I think you're right, but it's also a limited one, especially sort of in a fallen world, right? So again, we have, to put it in terms of lights, right? The church operates according to a brighter and higher light, right, than the political community does, which is not to say on the Anabaptist side that the political community has no light. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It has light, although it is a limited light. And this is very important. That should help us to manage our expectations, right?
Yeah.
You
Okay.
know,
Okay. So I agree. We have to manage our expectations, and the
mm,
failure to do that is actually very bad,
mhm,
both for the church and for the world. It seems to
absolutely.
me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Um,
there's an impulse in man towards the infinite and the eternal, right? Um, towards the limitless. Ultimately, we would
yeah.
think of that as being an orientation towards God. Um, it's a mistake, and a tragic mistake, to focus that on anything temporal, up into and including the political community, right? I mean, this is the kind of mistake that you find in German philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
working through Hegel and Karl Marx, right? Where they, I think that they're right in recognizing, both of them, that political community is among the very highest temporal goods that we
Mm-hmm.
experience, right? It's actually hard for us to imagine what it would be like not living in a decent temporal community, right? Our political community, right? I mean, that's just brutish and close to, close to death at any moment, right? If you really think about it.
Yeah. I mean, people aren't meant. Look, the ancient philosophers understood this
Right.
clearly, right? They even worked it into their definition of the human being.
That's right. That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Aristotle says we're a political animal.
That's right. Yeah. You think of how little culture we would have if we were just on our own, just in terms of like having the differentiation of labor, allowing some people to be scholars and priests and things like that. I mean, so much of civilization is built up, right, out of the exigencies of political community. At the same time, political community is not God.
Yeah.
It's not the alpha and the omega. And, at the end of the day, Hegel thinks that the political community fully realized in its rationality is the omega point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's just flat wrong, right?
Yeah, right. So
to seek that from politics is
okay.
a big mistake.
So what I might say is this, right? If we really believe in the resurrection of the body,
Mm-hmm.
and I do,
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure I've got you on record as believing that too.
Yes, I confess it on
Okay.
a regular basis, on a weekly basis.
If we really believe in the resurrection of the body, then one would imagine
Mm-hmm.
that upon the parousia, right, that there would be suddenly perfect justice among men in
Mm-hmm.
the material sphere.
Right.
That is indeed, in some weird and mystical way that we can't yet understand,
Sure.
part of the eschaton.
Yep.
I think the mistake we're making, right, is that somehow we realize that eschaton
Right.
through our actions in this world.
That's right.
That we're bringing it about,
Right.
by trying to construct a just political order, and eventually we can tweak the machine enough
That's right.
that we can arrive at that moment.
That's right. Yeah. So maybe I think it's absolutely correct. And let me just say, kind of sum up maybe a couple of points we're making here. So ironically, perhaps it might sound, one of the first responsibilities of a Christian in politics, right, is to oppose utopianism of any sort, right? Is to insist on recognizing that the eschatological orientation of man is not satisfied and fulfilled within politics, right? Yeah. And that eschatological hope that we have is not about this world, right? Mm-hmm. It's about the kingdom of God. And so any kind of utopian I mean, it sounds so Christian to say, I want a world without suffering, right?
Yeah.
And you would say, then you don't want the fallen world, right?
That's right.
You like, as long as the fallen world exists, you're going to have suffering.
Yeah. So let me, to my Protestant brothers and sisters out there, right? Let's understand that on this point, we're definitely on the same page. I know that this is sort of one of those things where Catholics and Protestants sometimes think they're opposed. Mm-hmm. I think we're closer on this than many have historically imagined.
Yeah, I think so too.
And it really comes to light right here, mm-hmm, on this issue. The mistake you're making if you're thinking that I can tweak the political environment and the socioeconomic conditions of people, right, or whatever, to bring about this eschaton, to bring about this world without suffering, that's to think that the solution to our problems actually comes from our own ingenuity, our own work, when in fact we're hopelessly unable to solve our problems. Right. Again, we can make things better or worse.
Sure.
We can do rough things around the edges, but we can't fundamentally eliminate death.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And look, let's take a look at COVID-19.
Right. Yeah.
You know, we've eradicated diseases in the past. We have. But you get new ones.
Right.
There is no world in which, in the fallen world, there's no future in which there is no disease.
Right.
I'm sorry. You're going to discover new disease. They'll just pop up.
Right. Yeah, you're right. And you're like, darn. I thought we had this
problem. No,
that's right.
No, because it's built in. It's there's a defect in the structure, right? What Martin Luther described as an arcanum of sin in the world.
Yeah, that's a good phrase. So I mean, I think that's on the negative side, right? In terms of the responsibility of Christians, right, is to not make a certain mistake and to oppose a certain kind of error, right?
So let's think about what the responsibility is then. So
yeah, that's right.
I want to come back to the original question. Do Christians have a responsibility in politics? If we have the light of the gospel, if somehow we have a perspective that sort of prelapsarian, or not, that's not what I meant to say. If we have a, if the unregenerate man does not have the perspective,
right,
then do we owe it? Is this an area where we owe the benefit of our insight, of our enlightenment as Christians, to the political order? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, to the political order, to the economic order, for sure. I mean, I want to say there's still, even though faith and politics, church and state are really distinct, I think they're also really related. And one way of stating that would be to sort of speak to the anthropological unity of man. Another way of stating that would be in terms of the applicable law, right? So this is a little bit sort of archaic way of talking about it, but I think it's still useful. Thomas Aquinas and others, he's not unique in this, distinguish between, the eternal law, the divine law, the natural law, and the human law, right? There's a lot of law there, right? But, roughly speaking, divine law is that part of the eternal law, that part of the plan of God in his own mind and will, that's been revealed to us, right? In supernatural revelation. That divine law includes different kinds of laws, right? So you could talk about the ceremonial law, judicial law. These are very standard kind of scholastic distinctions. We could also talk about the new law. Sometimes that gets left out, right? The law of grace, interestingly, right? It's an important one. But then there's also the moral law, right? And that moral law, we could just say, roughly speaking, is summed up in the 10 Commandments. Just more to say than that, but that's, roughly speaking, summed up in the 10 Commandments. And that is, and this is interesting because this is an ecumenical view for probably the first 100, 150 years, 200 years after the Reformation, that the natural law and the moral law are really the same. That is, that the 10 Commandments, with the exception of the Sabbath keeping, right, are really all things that we should know through the light of natural reason, right?
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I was just thinking about this the other day. I was teaching the play by Aristophanes, The Clouds, right? Which is a comedy, right? But in there's a whole sort of section on the respecting your mother and your father, right? I was just thinking obviously there's a lot of problems with ancient Greek culture for sure, but even there, right? Like this shines through. You must honor your father and your mother, right? I mean, it's probably one of the honoring your parents is probably one of the most universal precepts moral precepts you could find. You can find it in Confucianism, Shintoism, Hinduism. I mean, it's everywhere, right?
Oh yeah, because it's so fundamental to the functioning of any society.
Yeah, I think so.
And interestingly, it's heavily under attack today.
That's right.
In the West.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think trying to get rid of parents is ultimately an act of impiety, in sort of deep structural ways. But I think sort of positively speaking about political responsibility, that's where our political responsibility lies primarily, right? That is in advocating with this light, as we've talked about, a brighter, better light on the natural law and the moral law that we get through revelation, advocating for the basic precepts of the natural law, right?
Okay, so
to put that very succinctly, the 10 Commandments, right, as well as you can. That brings up some interesting questions, but I
have some practical questions to follow up with.
Okay, go
all
ahead.
right. So the voter,
Mm-hmm.
Does he vote in accord with this, or is he restricted only to sort of persuasion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he has to follow, of course, a politician, a voter, especially in our own sort of setting, has to vote in a way that's in accordance with the 10 Commandments, has to vote in a way that's in accordance with the natural law.
So cannot vote in favor, you would say,
mm-hmm.
I think, right? I don't want to quote, you tell me if I'm right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You would say that when you go to the voting booth, you cannot morally cast a vote for a policy or an agenda
mm-hmm.
that is irreconcilable in principle with the moral law.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, yep, that's correct.
Okay.
I think that follows from the obligations of the natural law. The basis, the most basic presupposition of being virtuous, right, is you do good and avoid evil, right?
Right.
And so,
so
you got to do that.
Now, obviously, this is exactly that spot where people say, we all agree. Now, they don't all agree, but many people will say, we all agree that that's true. But what if you have, evils in both choices or something?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then, I mean, I kind of know what the answer is, right?
Mm.
The first thing you do is ask, are we talking about per se moral evils or moral evils per accidens? And that's a distinction that many people today don't recognize. Unfortunately, It's probably a conversation for another podcast.
Sure. But, yeah, for sure.
But I think, so when you come up against this question, there are going to be some practical responses. What happens though, if you have a case where genuinely you have two competing choices, right, at the voting booth, both of which are committed to per se moral evils? What does the Christian do then?
Yeah, I mean, if they're both sides are committed to per se moral evils, that would be quite difficult. I think there, you end up going for the one that's going to allow for the best good, I guess, the most good under the circumstances. That's kind of brings in questions about outside of intention, right? That sort of thing. What is it you're intending there? I mean, so
you would have to not intend to advance the agenda.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. You would have to intend to mitigate the other agenda or something.
That's right. Yeah. This is what we call like principal double effect, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so I think here what you have to deal with is, maybe I'm stopping this greater evil, right, by voting for this candidate who is good insofar as he's stopping this greater evil. You're not choosing the lesser evil. That's important, right? You're choosing the good that's there without intending the other consequence, right, that's going to flow from it, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's in a very strange set of circumstances where everything's piled up equally in terms of per se evils. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying. I think a lot of people, Catholics, go to the voting booth though, thinking that that's the choice they have in front of them.
I mean, so if you just run through sort of like basic commandments here, right? Honor the father and mother, don't commit murder, don't covet another's goods, right? Don't covet, I mean, those sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
Really, we're talking about a small kind of, not a wide range of issues here, right?
Mm-hmm.
In some ways. I mean, obviously when you get down to details, then policies run fairly wild, but you have to sort of think, what is the purpose of this? Is where I think you kind of move a little bit more back to questions about political community. What is the purpose of government? Mm-hmm. What is it that we're trying to achieve? We could say the common good, and that's a correct answer, but then you need to say more. I think what you need to say ultimately is that what we're trying to achieve with human law, right, is the just development, exchange, and distribution of temporal goods. And then that requires you to think about justice. And
would you say between particular persons or universally?
Oh, I mean, of this community.
Yeah, of this community. That's
sure.
An important thing, I think, that often gets lost today.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have political obligations to non-citizens.
Yeah, I might have other obligations. That's an issue that today is very, I mean, it's obscured.
Sure, it is.
Right? It's obscured.
It's a problem. But I think one thing you could say is, and this is interesting because oddly enough, the scholastics were really, the medieval scholastics, we tend to think about medieval governments as being kind of totalitarian. The truth is often much to the contrary, right? The medieval theologians talked about that unjust taxation is theft, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. And that a monarch could be disposed for it, right? Yeah. And by unjust taxation, any taxation that goes beyond what's just necessary, right, for defending the common good, debasing the currency, right, was considered a form of theft, right? So it's I think
abuse of office, and you can be sort of removed.
Yeah, exactly. So, actually, you find in the medieval theologians reasons for deposing a monarch, right? Mm-hmm. It's absolutism is a kind of late Renaissance, early Enlightenment form of thinking, right? So, I guess it's saying that I think we need to think about what government is for, right? Not what every good thing is for, but what government is for. Right. I think we tend to think something's good, so the government should do it. That's not the case, right? The government isn't there to do every good thing. It's there to do justice. Yeah.
In fact, you're here to do many of those good things, right?
That's right.
You
That's right.
personally,
right.
We as a sort of non-governmental institution, mm-hmm, or a mediating institution, mm-hmm, right? The local church or something.
Sure. Yeah, so I bring that. Yeah,
we do those things. That's our obligation.
That's right, absolutely. And I bring that up, Rich, just to say I think sometimes people are confused about the options because they think the government should be doing certain things that it shouldn't necessarily be doing.
Because it's a thing that should be done.
Right.
It's assumed that it's government that should do it, and that's clearly a category mistake.
That's right. Yeah. So they're not doing that thing, therefore it's evil, right? Et cetera, right? So, I mean, I think, again, if you think about the 10 commandments, certainly we have an obligation to worship God. So if somebody's keeping us from worshiping God, that's a per se evil, right?
Yeah.
Certainly we have an obligation not to directly intentionally kill the innocent. So if that's going on, that should be stopped, right? Yes. We have an obligation not to covet or to steal, right? So all, mm-hmm, stealing, right, should be stopped. So I think the issues we need to be concerned about for politics, right? As Christians, there are issues, but I think they're maybe a little bit narrower than maybe we've thought. We need to uphold property rights because stealing is contrary to the divine law, contrary to moral law, natural law, right? Mm-hmm. We need to insist on our liberty to worship God. Because we're obligated to worship God, right? Mm-hmm. We need to insist on, now this would be a little more controversial, right? But we need to insist on, at the very least, trying to reform our divorce situation. Do you know what I'm saying? I think at the very least, some sort of movement in the direction away from no fault divorce,
because marriage and family are so essential to the flourishing of a civil society.
That's right. We should
there are clearly religious concerns as well.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
But everyone recognized in the past, pagan or Christian, that the family from which children are born, right, is an essential part of society.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can't follow the commandment to honor your mother and your father unless you have a mother and father, right? You have a traditional family structure, right? I mean, obviously society needs to be interested in defending traditional family. It especially needs to be interested. I think a Christian should be especially interested in guarding parental rights, right? I mean, I think that's an area of really deep concern, right? In terms of the situation we live in here. I think thankfully in America, we probably have it better off than in most other countries, to be frank, at least in the kind of advanced world, or however you want to call it, first world. But still, that's an area I think of concern. That includes, right, the freedom to educate your child at home, right? Those sorts of things.
Or in the way that you discern, whichever way you discern.
That's right.
Yeah. Be the best way, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And that you make that decision, right? So I think that as a parent, those are the kinds of things that, that seem to be evident in the moral law, right? Again, I'm just going through the 10 Commandments. I'm not even trying to get real complicated here, right? Just looking at the 10 Commandments, right, as an apt summary. And this is, very, I think, keeping with the Catholic catechetical tradition, right, of when we think about, morality and the catechesis, right, we often work through the 10 Commandments. That's where our responsibility lies, right? Is in upholding that moral law in society. When we do that, I think we're being responsible and we're helping our fellow citizens and we're being just and we're being good citizens. One other just aspect, that commandment to honor thy father and thy mother is usually interpreted, of course, and again, this is very broadly, honoring authorities in general, and honoring your patria as part of that. There's sort of this, right now, a lot of hand-wringing about the relationship between patriotism and religion, right? And the apparent threat of Christian nationalism, whatever that happened.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
Again, as if having national allegiance is somehow offensive to
right
Christianity. In fact, it's the opposite, right?
Yeah. I think that what you want to say is, look, if you conflate Jesus and the nation, you got a problem, right? If you conflate the church and
but that's been the subject of our conversation
already.
Time, right?
That's right. Should you have piety? I mean that in the virtue sense, piety towards your patria. And the answer is yes. It's part of the natural law. It's part of the moral law. You should honor your country, honor those who went before you, all that sort of thing. Of course, as I said, don't conflate with the ultimate end, but there is a real kind of duty there to love one's country.
Well, because as we discussed earlier, right, if you didn't have it, you'd really be in trouble. Now, you may say that your country isn't perfect.
That's of course, needs, that's right.
Right. We in fact, we just discussed, we know your country's never going to be perfect.
That's right.
Better or worse.
That's right.
And maybe you wish it were a lot better, but if you didn't have it at all,
right, you'd
be in trouble.
Yeah. Absolutely. So if we kind of go back just to my way of review here, we want to oppose the responsibility of a Christian, oppose utopianism, oppose imitating eschatology, right? On the positive side, promote and advance religious liberty, the rights of parents, traditional family, patriotism, property rights, those sorts of things, right? That's where I think that our responsibility lies. Does that make sense?
It does. So the conclusion I'm drawing is Christians do have political responsibility. We should actually involve ourselves within certain limits, perhaps, in politics.
That's right. Yeah, I think so. And if you want to say, hey, I want to do more, great. Become a missionary, work for the poor, collect extra canned goods. I mean, there is this huge part of
go
society.
To soup kitchen.
Yeah, it's called civic society, right?
Right.
And political philosophy, and that's where churches and sort of other communities or volunteer organizations, Boy Scouts of America, all that stuff exists, right? Go forth, right?
Yeah, that more should be
and
done
do it.
is not the same as the government should do more.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the reason for that to some degree is, and this is maybe should have brought this forward earlier, but just maybe kind of start wrapping up with this, that, the St. Paul tells us, right, that the king, the prince, the magistrate, however you want to put it exactly, doesn't bear the sword in vain. He bears the sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he is interesting. He is the minister of God, right? In a sense, right? Not in a strong priesthood sense, but is an instrument of God. We don't want to, government is actually something that is part of the natural law, something that has been given to us for our good and for our benefit.
Mm-hmm.
It its primary instrument though is the sword,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
right.
that's what really distinguishes it. And I don't want to put down the sword in the sense of like say it's evil. There are times when the sword needs to be used, and the times when the threat of the sword needs to be used. But also, we obviously want to be very circumspect, right?
Well, if I'm
In
giving
the use of
canned
that.
goods at the end of a sword, that's called theft.
Right, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So there's God has blessed us, I think, with an order in which there are a variety of authorities, and there
Uh-huh.
are a variety of kind of overlapping and hierarchically arranged communities. Government and political community is a great blessing in a lot of ways, and should be used well, but there are many others as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we want to be very careful not to expect from human law what we should not expect. But then on those things that we do, right, know should belong to human law, we do want to insist on them, right? And again, those are the things like, the liberty to worship God, you know, um, honoring parents, protecting property rights, those sorts of things.
And if the government doesn't do that, who else is going to? What other community
Right.
does?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's when you get in a really bad shape,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
When it all falls apart, but I think at
Right.
least, I mean, there's
Yeah.
more to be said, of course,
Yeah.
Rich, there's a lot more, but I think that at least should kind of lay out some general parameters with which to think about the responsibility of a Christian citizen.
Yeah. I think that's great. I mean, we could have more conversations like this, right?
Mm,
And particularly dealing with some of the stickier issues where, you have to kind of look around the edges and see where the right answer lies.
mm,
We didn't get into those kinds of weeds here,
mm,
but establishing the principles is essential before we can have such a discussion.
right.
And really, I think many people today just don't even, they're not clear on what those principles are.
Mm, mm,
Because they haven't been taught to make the distinction between what's the job of this community or that community
right.
within.
Right.
Those of you in the audience, if you like this discussion, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit notifications and share our content. We really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.